We're talking today with the first commander of the International Space Station, Expedition 1 Commander Bill Shepard. Shep, it hardly seems that 10 years have passed since you launched on the Soyuz TM-31 spacecraft from the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan to begin that first expeditionary mission to the International Space Station. October 31st, 2000. Think back for a second. Very cold day, very foggy. What were your thoughts as you and your crewmates were about to embark on what amounted to a new era in human spaceflight?
The day went by really fast. We get up early in the morning, kind of the same process that we used to do a shuttle flight. It was foggy, kind of dew on all the windows. I waved goodbye to my wife, got on the bus, went down to the launch assembly area, got our spacesuits on. Then out of nowhere, my wife came up when we were suited up and gave me a big hug, which was something that you just don't do that in our program. I went out to the launch pad. We had probably 400 people. I think you were in the crowd at the base of the vehicle. This is a couple million pounds of rocket, all ready to go fly in space, all sitting there steaming and smoking, and you got 400 people right there. It was very, very exciting. Got in the vehicle, and after that, everything was on automatic. I mean, we stayed really busy. It was probably a day that a U.S. vehicle wouldn't have flown in just because of the weather, but the launch countdown was flawless, and the ascent was good. So.
As you lifted off, the onboard cameras inside the Soyuz capsule showed you pumping your fist in celebration as you and your crewmates were heading uphill. Once you reached orbit, it's always fascinating to me what this two-day transit in a Soyuz is like to go to its destination. Were your thoughts squarely on the procedures, the two-day trip to the station, or what would life be as you entered what at that time was a very neophyte vehicle?
Well, it was kind of a strange day for me because Sergei and Yuri were very experienced. I was pumping my fist mostly because as a crew we had waited a long time to get to that point in life where this was actually happening, and I was very keen to emphasize, let's go get this done. When we were up on orbit, we were pretty relieved to have all the risk of launch behind us. The process to get the pressure integrity of the Soyuz checked out is very lengthy. The Russians are very keen on really low leak rates, and so you have a lot of sitting in your couch while they sort that out. And then after that, it was just sort of contemplating what the docking would be like, and when you got on board the station, was it going to be as expected, or was it something really different? That was mostly what I thought about.
Fast forward 2 days, November 2nd, a very historic day. You dock, and you and Sergei and Yuri opened the hatch to the station for the first time. You float in, and you grasped hands in jubilation. Was there a sense of history for you and them at that time that you had basically opened up a new frontier, set a stage for a new way of living and working in space?
I don't think at that time we had that perspective. My focus was I had some things I had to do pre-hatch opening, to get ready to sample the atmosphere and bring gas samples back the next time a shuttle went back to Earth. So I had a bunch of stuff to do to get ready for the hatch opening. I really wanted either Sergei or Yuri to open the hatch and go in first, and I think Sergei was the first guy in. But then there was kind of a very busy scramble to do the initial things that we had to do, and particularly to find the TV hookup and the TV cable so we could give you that downlink. And we were really close to the wire, getting that all rigged and happy, and we almost missed it. So it was, and after the downlink was done, we just kind of all sat back and said, okay, we'll call it a day, because it was very hectic.
The station, of course, at that time was a primitive complex. 10 years ago, just a few modules, no significant infrastructure in there. How was day-to-day life? It's not the complex we see today, which is sort of like a city in the sky. It was primitive. How did you go about your business day-to-day?
Well, it was kind of like camping out. We didn't have the CO2 scrubbing wasn't we didn't have the air conditioning and the CO2 scrubbing up the way that we needed to. There was some concern about that. Our O2 production wasn't online. There were a lot of things that were very limited in terms of their robustness. A lot of really single string or almost just make-do life support systems that we had to bring up more capability. So the first week was really living in a sleeping bag, running around with a checklist and a bunch of tools trying to get this stuff all to get cranking. We did have some issues, I think, with both the Electron and the CO2 scrubber, but we got by them.
Did you feel like pioneers driving that spike like the Intercontinental Railroad?
I think at the end of the expedition, when it was clear that the time and space was finite and we had to come home, and how did we do and what would people think of our time on orbit, I think we had that sense, but not up front. We were just really busy.
Shep, you commented on your first space shuttle flight in 1988 when you were orbiting over a landmass near the Arctic that was desolate, that you felt like you might be viewing the surface of another planet. Did you have any similar emotion on your expedition?
In a sense. In 1988, we're on Atlantis, early in the morning, upside down, second flight day. We're over Siberia, winter. You could look out, see the surface of a large body. You could look 1,000 miles in any direction. There was no contrail, no railroad track, no road, no smokestack plume. I'm looking and thinking, you know, there isn't a good reason why I'm not looking at some foreign body, some other planet. I felt something similar when I got back from Expedition 1. I made it a point, shortly after landing, we got back to the crew quarters. I talked our flight surgeon into letting me in a vehicle and just driving around the parking lot. And I was feeling really good. I was able to walk around and stand up. I didn't have any problems with getting around. And I said, you know, if I could get in a vehicle and drive it without hazarding myself or anybody else, we could probably go to Mars, where there'd be months of weightlessness, land, and be productive. And I very strongly had that sense. I drove the van around the parking lot a little bit, got out, shut the door, and I said to myself, we can do this.
And you've talked in other interviews and forums about the technical culture of how you do spaceflight, how we do spaceflight. What does all that mean? Is this something that you experienced yourself during Expedition 1, during the time you were up there?
Yes, very much. I think that's personally one of the biggest takeaways for me from having worked on ISS and with the Russians and the other partners. Here at Johnson, we have a lot of legacy from Mercury, Apollo, Gemini, the shuttle program, and we do things a certain way because that's how we know how to do them. I think one of the biggest things that I learned, having lived and worked and trained in Russia, was there are other approaches to the same problem, and it's a great strength to see somebody else attack an operational issue a certain way. And the difficulty is when you sit back and say, you know, maybe the Russians have a better way to do this, you would get a lot of pushback on the American side, and vice versa. When we tried to instill some operational technique or procedure on the Russians, it was the same rebound. And I'm going, really, the strength of a program like ISS is we should take the best of both of these cultures, but we are somewhat locked in the past about how we did things 10, 20, 30 years ago. We've got to get out of that mindset.
And Shep, in that vein, almost 2 decades have passed since the ISS program as we know it today was conceived back in 1993 through cooperative agreements. But there were questions, and in some camps, some controversy about how well the cooperative effort with the Russians would unfold, how all this was going to work, different languages, different cultures, different ways of doing business from a technical standpoint. In the end, as of today, how well did the United States and Russian space engineers, officials, managers get along back then in the formulative days to get this program underway. And in that sense, how did you and your crewmates get along?
Well, you probably have to talk about how well we got along on different levels. Initially, programmatically, there was wild enthusiasm. This simmered down a little bit when it got down to really how hard it was to integrate all the procedures, specifications, tolerances, standards, literally thousands of things that have to be meshed between what the U.S. does and what Russia and the other partners bring to the table. That got to be very difficult, but from an engineer-manager standpoint, people worked their way through that. Sure, we had disagreements. I often was asked by media, Shep, we understand that you guys are having some difficulties negotiating this with the Russians, and I would say, yeah, we have huge difficulties, and everybody get really excited about that. But I said, at the end of the day, we draw the line, we make some compromise, or somebody puts their foot down and say we're going to do it this way, and we move on. And the program got to the launch pad by those means. I can't say enough about the crew. Sergei, Yuri, and I, we were extremely tight. I don't think, I'm a little bit biased, but I don't think I've seen a better crew, at least in the modern era on station, than what we had. We had some significant challenges, but our synergy, our cooperation was really exceptional. The thing that did surprise me about the crew and how we got along was that we knew we were very compatible people on the ground, but our experiences and our sense of being a team on orbit just got stronger the whole time we flew. And everybody's glad to have a mission conclude and go home to friends and family, but I was really kind of sad to see that was over. And I think most astronauts and cosmonauts look back to the day where they can get back in that kind of a team.
You guys were very much hands-on. As a crew, you helped develop many elements of station operations, something as germane as the formats for computer interfaces on board, those types of things, technical reference materials that the ground would use to help you out. Talk a little bit about the impact of what that meant to have a sort of technical hands-on capability to develop this new child called the ISS.
It was a very interesting area of work. I started out going to Russia. I started my formal training over there in 1996, and I was there for almost 5 years. I thought initially with our work with the Russians that because the United States was carrying most of the financial load for putting the station together and making it happen, that we could create a standard where we would have English as a unified language. The reality of working in Russia, I was with engineers and technicians who built stuff for Sputnik and Gagarin's capsule. And I decided that the only way I was going to understand how these guys thought and why they did what they did a certain way was if I could talk to them. So it was clear to me that Russian language, we weren't going to change the Russian approach to how they thought about doing space, and the way to work with that was to get more involved with their language and their culture, which we did. But it made me appreciate how difficult it was to deal with space and space operations as a second language. And we said right there, we've got to have a highly graphical world that we operate. We understand the space station we operate it with, so that people from all the different partner countries who come to station not having English as a primary language or a first language can deal with the operational environment. So you'll find on ISS today a lot of this graphical basis, and that's why it got put in there.
And in that vein, where we are today with a multinational capability and responsibility, many centers around the world, a global village, if you will, it really was your expedition, was it not, that helped set an international cooperative tone for ISS operations, in the sense that you sort of defined the command role for ISS and how that would work between those on orbit and those supporting you on the ground.
We tried to make a couple big steps in that direction. Again, it goes back to the technical culture and the legacy that we have in both programs. Flight control and space flight, we're very dependent on the ground to assist us and tell us what we need to do, particularly in emergencies. But the station in its early life had long periods of time where we did not have any ground communications because we didn't have our satellite links up. So the question became, were the authorities of the commander and what the crew was responsible for, was that the same as the way that we would operate the space shuttle? And our sense of it was no. The commander and the crew had to have the authority on board to make the calls in real time when they thought it was necessary. And that's still a little bit of the thinking today. We had several instances in our expedition where Houston, we'd fly over Houston first thing in the morning, and Houston would say, okay, you guys, the flight plan for the day, we have a quick change, 1400, we want to do something else. And then 25 minutes later, we'd be over Europe, and we'd be talking to Moscow, and Moscow would undo that and insert something else in that block of time. And this happened a few instances, and I got on the horn one day and I said, look, we are the International Space Station. You two guys got to get together on the ground, get your act together, then call us, because we're gonna execute one plan, not one for Moscow and one for Houston. And that's another aspect of this that we helped to push. The most important point is if we look at what we've got to do in expeditions, voyages a long way from planet Earth, certainly to the moon, but beyond that as well. We're going to have COM outages that'll be substantial. So our relationship of what the crews are doing on board and what the people are trying to make happen on the ground, this is all part of the command structure that's got to be worked out, and that's why station's so important.
And to its credit, the station as it is today in its matured, expansive state, ISS crews have commented that living on the station, astronauts and cosmonauts feel as if they're in a place that's well away from the Earth, even though they're fairly close to the Earth mileage-wise. Did your crew have this sense, especially in such a rudimentary vehicle as it was at that time?
We did, particularly when Destiny, the U.S. lab, came up and we started having big optical windows, and Sergei and Yuri and I would look at the window and watch the planet go by. It was really funny because Yuri would point to the places where he was a MiG-21 fighter pilot on strip alert, ready for the Cold War, and I would talk about places I had been in the Navy. And we realized in that moment that not only were we part of something way bigger than what's happening on the surface of the Earth, but the Earth was there and we were here. And when you're a couple hundred miles up in space, there are no convenient paths home. You are there with some pretty strong constraints about where you can go and what you can do. And you really have to act and live as though you're in a separate world. And this is a big step, I think, philosophically, in terms of how astronauts and cosmonauts see themselves in space. We haven't really had that before.
Traditions, it wasn't all just work, but you as the pathfinding crew for this new vehicle, this new way of doing business in space, you set traditions for yourself. Tell us a little bit about the ceremony, the pomp and circumstance, the traditions.
The Russian protocol, Russians have a lot of space tradition. It's mostly on the ground. Pre-launch, they are very adamant about many of the things they do as ceremony to get to the launch pad. On orbit, it's not the same, and I wanted to try and extract a couple pieces of tradition, mostly from ships, because I wanted to do two things. One is to give the crew a sense of that our expedition had a time to it, and when we were done, I wanted to make it clear to the crews on board and the control centers on the ground that Expedition 1 had finished our responsibilities and we were handing over to Yuri Usachev. So part of what we did was to institute a change of command, which they still do today. This is something the Russians really didn't understand this. and it's certainly part of the Russian Navy, and this is something that's done in Russia, just not in the space program. But I believe today they really embrace this and they like it because it's a clear distinction of, okay, Expedition 1's time is done and now it's Expedition 2 on deck. And they understand that, and to give it a little bit of emphasis, on ships we have a little bell, and it's a ceremonial thing when crews come aboard or depart from another ship, and so we had a little bell up there, and the ISS still rings the bell. So I thought those were important markers for how ISS and the expeditions pace themselves.
Shep, as you've watched this decade unfold and the assembly missions and some of this work that is considered by many to be some of the most complex stuff that's ever been done in human spaceflight history, including Apollo, have you been impressed at how well together the station has come together, has been formulated? When you look on a day-to-day basis, the amount of technical problems that have been incurred by this mammoth structure are pretty few and far between.
I think by any parameter, and I can't take much credit for this, but by any parameter, the station's performance in terms of how it's flown and how it's been built have been exceptional. I think far better than the designers could have hoped for. I think it's a great sign for what our capabilities are for the future. I'm thinking about when we were first getting into what ISS was going to look like, how big it was going to be, how much work it was going to take to assemble it, I always had in the back of my mind that if we're going to do things that are really expansive in space, leaving the planet and going somewhere else in the solar system, the vehicles that we're going to build are going to have several characteristics. One is they're going to be very big. They're going to be too big to be launched on a single lift with even a large booster. They're going to have to be assembled in orbit. They're going to have to draw on the capacities of several different countries, and space station is all of that. And so I think today that those questions are behind us. I mean, this is all a blueprint for how we need to do things in the future.
Last year, for the first time, hopefully not the last, all of the partner nations, agencies were represented on board at a single time. It really was a testament, I think, and it struck many people at that time to what this complex was designed to be in an international sense. Are you impressed by the manner at how the station has been able to operate through linguistic, and cultural, and technical differences just by nature of the way people around the globe operate?
It's been exceptional in terms of the cooperation on the ground and how tight the crews are when they fly. I can think of any number of foreign astronauts who have joined us at JSC and had training here who become very Americanized. And this is maybe part of what happens. And I can also say myself, when I lived in Russia, Sergei came up to me one day, not too far from our launch, and he said, you know, Shep, you came here and you had certain kind of angles to how you saw things, but you've changed. And I looked at him and said, wow, you're right, I have changed. And I think this is one of the real strengths of this program, that we have shown that humans can do really substantial endeavors, that we are flexible and adaptable, and the space station and how this has proceeded is an example of this.
From those first baby steps a decade ago to what it constitutes today with 6 people living and working on board, and all of the incredible technical achievement that the space station has drawn to this point, what do you think the space station represents today, and what ultimately, a decade from now perhaps, will its legacy be?
It has to have some short-term and long-term results. In the short term, we have a fantastic orbital laboratory to do research in 6 or 8 basic areas that we've never really had before. And I'm hoping that the crews now and subsequent will make great use of that. And that's its fundamental value to the nation and to the partnership. Beyond that, space station has really laid the foundation for how and where we might go further in space. And I think its legacy will be, this was an episode where we got our act together and figured out how to do this.
You and Sergei and Yuri launched from the same launch pad that Yuri Gagarin launched from on April 12, 1961, that every Soyuz has launched from. Next April 12th, half a century, the 50th anniversary of Yuri Gagarin's launch. This is a pretty epic moment. It's also the 30th anniversary of the first space shuttle flight, and it came just weeks before the 50th anniversary of Alan Shepard launching as the first American in space. So this is a rich spring in terms of anniversaries coming up. But you stood on that launch pad. Yuri Gagarin left the planet from that launch pad as the first human in space. What did Gagarin achieve in a big picture sense when he took off in Vostok 1, and what did leaving the planet mean at that time and today for us as a species?
Well, that's a big question. I think clearly Yuri had just tremendous courage to do that. Very few people have the ability or the willingness to take a risk like that and to have it be successful. And Yuri's a world icon because of that. But he showed that humans had a place other than on the surface of the planet. I think part of his legacy and what the space station is about, we have 6 people now in the crew who, as you said, see themselves living apart from Earth. Space station is really about having humans see themselves with a place in the solar system, not on the Earth. And the question is really, how far can that go? You know, where else can we live and work and be productive? And space station has asked that question. It's up to us to figure out in the future what's the answer.
Bill Shepard, Expedition 1 Commander, 10 years later. Thanks very much. Appreciate it.